The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Andrew Capehart, lead staff person for the APS Technical Assistance Resource Center here at WRMA. I'll be moderating the webinar for us, and we're going to be hearing about some promising practices from the state of Hawaii, and I will introduce our speakers shortly. Next slide. A quick disclaimer about today's webinar. The National Adult Maltreatment Reporting System and the Adult Protective Services Technical Assistance Resource Center is a project of the U.S. Administration for Community Living, Administration on Aging, Department of Health and Human Services, administered by WRMA Incorporated. The contractor's findings, conclusions, and points of view do not necessarily represent the federal government's official policy. Next slide. So we'd like to tell you just a little tiny bit about our APS Technical Assistance Resource Center, or the APS TARC. We're here to help APS programs in any way that we can. Just reach out to us. We'll have some contact information displayed at the end of the webinar, and you can check out our newly rebooted website, which has all kinds of new information on it. There'll be a web link for that too at the end of the webinar. Next slide. And a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the web at a later date. We'll notify all the webinar registrants via email when it's posted online. You may use your telephone or computer to connect to audio. Just select the option that you prefer on your GoToWebinar control panel. An example is displayed here where you can make your selection. All participants are muted for this webinar, so there's no need to mute your line manually. Next slide. If you have any questions of our presenters, you can simply type them into the questions box. An example of where to type them is posted on the slide, and it's circled here in purple. You don't have to wait until we pause for questions to submit yours. You can type your questions at any time as we move along, and then when it's time for questions, I will pause and relay those to our speakers. Next slide. So now we'd like to administer a brief poll just so you could tell us a little bit about which of the following categories you think matches your profession best. And I will launch that poll right now. This should be open for everybody. So if you could just click on the screen, let us know which of these categories best represents your profession. We'll leave it up for a few more seconds while the votes roll in. It looks like people are voting right now. I'll share these results with everybody as soon as we are done collecting them. We'll leave it up for about another 10 seconds. And you just vote by clicking on your screen and selecting which of these best fits your profession. All right, and I'm going to close that poll out now and then share the results with everybody. Looks like 67% are APS professionals, 15% other social service professional, and then we have 19% that fall under other in general, other some sort of professional. So thanks for taking that poll for us. Helps us understand who we are speaking to. Next slide. So I'll take a brief moment to introduce today's speakers. With us today are 3 staff from Hawaii Adult Protective Services and 2 staff from University of Hawaii. Our speakers are located on 2 different islands. Kawika is with the University of Hawaii, Maui, and Scott Seto is with Hawaii APS, and both of them are located on the island of Maui. Donna, Shitabata, and Lori Tsuruda are also with Hawaii Adult Protective Services, while Tammy is with the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and they are located on the island of Oahu, where Honolulu is located. They'll be talking with us today about their APS program and what they've done with quality assurance for their APS Enhancement Grant from the United States Administration for Community Living. So I will turn things over to our first speaker, Scott Seto. Scott, the floor is yours.
Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. All right, everybody. First off, aloha and welcome, and thanks for taking time out of your day to be with us as we share our efforts in addressing Hawaii's APS quality assurance with you. Special shout out first off to the ACL and WRMA crew, Andy and his co-workers, for assisting us in preparation for today's presentation. Also, big thanks to our statewide APS administrator. I hope she's on board today, Lisa Amador, for her support and vision in moving Hawaii APS forward. Okay, a little bit about us first, a system overview. Adult Protective and Community Services Branch is part of the Social Services Division of the Department of Human Services, State of Hawaii. We are just one of four different divisions within the Department of Human Services. Within the Social Service Division is our sister agency, which is CWS or CPS. There are also three other divisions, Medicaid Division, what we call MedQuest Division, also our Benefit Employment Services Division or our Welfare Division, along with the Division of Vocational Rehab. There are also affiliate or attached agencies, which are also which include the Hawaii Housing Authority or Public Housing, the Office of Youth Services, and the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility, as well as the Commission on the Status of Women. The State of Hawaii Human Services is just one of 17 departments, so we fall under the executive branch of our state government. Okay, we are state administered, so all APS laws, administrative rules and procedures go across our state. There are 5 section offices located on the main islands. Oahu, of course, being the major island, there is one section there. Maui, where I'm located, we also cover the surrounding islands or smaller islands of Molokai and Lanai. Kauai Island, and then there's Hawaii Island, or better known as the Big Island. Given its vastness per se, it's bigger than all the other islands combined. There are 2 sections on that island, one in the eastern portion and the other in the western portion of the island rather. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, rural and urban on the 8 major islands. Oahu, if any of you have been here before, are aware that it consists of our state capital, Honolulu, which is where our main branch administration offices are located. Also the most popular tourist destination in the state, Waikiki Beach. And just to give you an overview, Hawaii is highly dependent economic-wise on tourism. There are over 8 million plus visitors a year that come to the islands, 2 million of which visit the island of Maui also. Hawaii has an extensive multicultural population stemming from our plantation era period. There's also a large military presence on the islands. There's 4 large military installations on the island of Oahu. On the south side, Pearl Harbor and Hickam Air Force Base, Pearl Harbor Naval Station rather, and Hickam Air Force Base, Schofield Barracks, Army Barracks in the center part of Oahu. And on the eastern portion, on the peninsula of Mokapu, is in Kaneohe is the Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station. There are also Coast Guard stations on all the other islands, so they do play a major part of our economy as well, military here, given our strategic presence in the middle of the Pacific. 6 major ethnic groups migrated to the islands, basically as indentured contract laborers. This stemmed from our plantation era period from the 1800s to the 1930s. These major immigrant groups that migrated here were inclusive of Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Koreans, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos. The largest ethnic group today in our islands are the Filipino population, which make up nearly 25% of the state's overall population count. Recent migrations from the COFA countries as well, which are the compact of association of COFA Micronesians migrating to Hawaii, given our proximity to the Eastern Pacific, or the Western Pacific that is, and also a growing Hispanic population in Hawaii as well. Native Hawaiians and part Hawaiians account for approximately 20% of the state's population. There exists what's referred to as Hawaiian homelands, but given that there's no federal or tribal recognition of Native Hawaiians, there's no governing authority related to APS or Native protocols, etc. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, Hawaii APS Laws. Andy has put it in the handout section of the sidebar there. If you'd like to go to this site, this covers all of the Adult Protective Services Act. You can see what we do, what we're tasked to do, our mandates, etc. Basically, we cover 6 types of abuse: caregiver neglect, self-neglect, financial exploitation, physical abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse. 2, carry out or arrange for essential activities of daily living, or 3, abuse. So vulnerable older adults also need to be vulnerable as well in order to be eligible for APS services here in Hawaii. We do nursing facilities, community care foster homes, adult residential care homes, work programs such as Goodwill, etc. That's kind of inclusive. We pretty much investigate all situations, be it intrafamilial or extrafamilial. Next slide, please. Okay, our staffing. There's approximately 85 plus workers statewide who work within the APS system here in the state, inclusive of supervisors or section administrators, much like myself, centralized intake workers, which is located on the island of Oahu. We have a separate intake unit, so all calls about allegations of abuse or neglect to vulnerable adults go into our central intake line on Oahu. There is one auditor, and that is located on the island of Oahu, but the outer islands or neighbor islands can also tap into her expertise if need be, should a financial case come to fruition on one of the other islands. RNs, there are 7 RNs statewide. Our lead RN is one of the presenters today, Laurie Saruda. She's with our Program Development Department on Oahu. And then the 6 other nurses are dispersed amongst the other sections throughout the state. Investigators, case managers, social service assistants, clerical staff, and of course, administrative staff, which includes our Program Development Office on Oahu, as well as our Staff Development Office on Oahu as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay.
Hi, good morning. This is Donna Shitabata. I'm with the Program Development Office. I'm going to be taking it here. So in Hawaii, APS investigations result in a disposition as to whether or not the alleged abuse occurred. The burden of proof that we use is the preponderance of the evidence, which is per our procedures. In Hawaii, we have 2 dispositions or 2 outcomes, whether the alleged abuse is confirmed or not confirmed. Next slide, please. Okay, so per Hawaii administrative rule, a disposition as to whether abuse occurred shall be made and documented within 60 calendar days from the date of the report. Therefore, we refer to our tracker as the 60-day tracker, which we will be sharing with you in this webinar. So in APS in Hawaii, we send written notice of the disposition to the alleged perpetrators. Confirmed perpetrators have 90 calendar days from the date of notice to appeal. When an APS disposition is appealed, the burden of proof is upon APS. The Administrative Appeals Office, or AAO, facilitates appeals for all Department of Human Services offices. If APS or the perpetrator disagrees with the hearing officer's decision, then either party may appeal to the Hawaii State Judiciary. So as it shows on the slide, they can go all the way from Circuit Court all the way up to the Supreme Court. Next slide, please. So in Hawaii, we share our computer database system with Hawaii Child Welfare Services. It is DOS-based and is quite antiquated, about 30 years old. Next slide, please. So what led to the need for this project? So in 2014, DHS contracted with UH Center on Aging to evaluate APS and to provide recommendations for our restructuring. So some of the focal points included conducting an environmental scan of how we're doing in Hawaii to identify gaps, areas of need, and what we're doing well. And to do so, they examined APS programs locally, nationally, and internationally as far as best practices in APS. Next slide, please. So going on with what led to the need for the project. So areas of recommended improvement included the following. So regarding centralized intake, this recommendation was to reinforce consistency. Prior to 2015, each APS office received and processed their own incoming reports of abuse. Starting in January 2015 was the start of a gradual transition to statewide intake. As of September 2017, the intake unit on Oahu processed reports of abuse statewide. So we will be showing you some of the tools developed that will help us to improve our data collection and improve our APS practice in general. Next slide, please.
Good morning and good afternoon. This is Lori. Our grant overview. Our grant was to have improved data collection, increased use of evidence-based practices and APS tools. Our goals were to improve investigations and victim services with a quality assurance process and tools to ensure timely and complete investigations. Also, full participation in the NAMRS data collection effort by crosswalking and submitting as much equivalent Hawaii data with NAMRS's detailed 6-entity case component data as possible. Next slide. So our anticipated products was collection of new NAMRS data elements, ongoing NAMRS case component, that XML submission. We didn't have such a program, so we had to create it, and now that we have it, we can submit in the future. We wanted a risk assessment tool to identify victims' needs and track service referrals and provision of services during our APS investigations. Next slide. So our process was development and execution of contracts with the participants of proposed tasks. We established departmental receipt of federal funds and payments to participants. We had to do the establishment of departmental fiscal accounting staff to complete and submit federal required funding and budgeting reports. And we had ongoing close scheduled meetings to stay on schedule as much as possible. Next slide. So collaboration was key. We scheduled an ongoing communication between former branch administrator, program development staff, and participants focused on timely and quality investigations. We did dynamic QA tool and web-based computer system updates. We tweaked the tools and the system as we needed and as we went along. We reviewed tools to be utilized internally and self-administered, and strengths were to be celebrated and challenges addressed. Next slide.
Hi, this is Tammy from the University of Hawaii Center on Aging. I wanted to quickly encourage people to ask questions, type in your questions. Andy is moderating that. We encourage questions. As Donna mentioned previously, there was a 2014 APS evaluation, which resulted in recommendations. This evaluation also resulted in a draft quality assurance review tool being developed. This tool was then fully fleshed out to be 11 pages and piloted during a 2017 QA review by the university, an initial review. The tool covered intake to appeals process, and items covered the many documentation expectations, including what was expected to be in the open-ended case logs and physical case folders. So the goal of this 2017 QA review was to pilot the review tool, the 11-page tool, find out to what extent does actual documentation of investigators across the state align with state-level documentation expectations, and then make some recommendations moving forward. In this review, cases with multiple intakes were prioritized to see what perhaps leads up to a client coming back into the system. We found out that it took about 3 hours to review the documentation from one intake and complete the 11-page review form, with the most efficient review being done when conducted in one sitting. The results were shared with APS in early 2018, and then from late 2018 to 2019, with one of the recommendations being to revisit the form and consider shortening it so that a review can be completed in a shorter period of time, therefore perhaps used more frequently, but still cover the essential elements of an investigation, because it is rare for someone to have 3 hours to review just one case's documentation. We're happy to report that a shorter form was developed and used in a more recent review of 32 intakes and supplemented by abuse-specific tools. The goal of this more recent QA was to pilot the shorter review tool and find out what perhaps happened since the last review. We got a little smarter, so cases with just one abuse report were used as a basis for the case selection to make piloting of the tool more streamlined, since that was one of the goals. And the focus this time was on reviewing the open-ended case log documentation that is part of the investigative process to identify evidence of the investigative steps required by our state law, and also to see how well this open-ended documentation aligns with the information investigators had in 2018 started entering into the web-based 60-day tracker you are hearing about. Next slide, please. So underlying the most recent review were two tools, as I mentioned, very shortened compared to the 2017 tool, a 3-page general tool used for all investigations, and then a 2-page abuse-specific tool. We will be showing the self-neglect abuse-specific tool a little later in this presentation. Next slide, please. The general 3-page review tool aligns with the web-based 60-day tracker you will be seeing in a live demo shortly, and went back to the basics regarding what our state laws and policies are telling us to do in terms of the investigative process. So what you're seeing on the screen are the essential actions being expected of investigators. Those are the checkmark topics and range from the initial AV and AP contact and interview to additional interviews, the consult with the supervisor about the disposition, sharing the disposition with the AV and AP, entering the disposition into the computer system. This is both in closed end and open end form, entering the disposition, and mailing a formal notice of disposition to the AP. Donna mentioned that previously. Using the review tool can help in determining to what extent these essential actions are documented in open-ended case logs. So what is being documented consistently across our state, for example, is something we found out. Which actions are documented perhaps not as consistently? Kawika is now going to show you the web-based 60-day tracker and other parts of the Shaka system. Next slide, please.
Yeah, aloha, everyone. This is Kawika. I'm with Maui College Software Development Center. And what we're going to do, if you can hand me screen sharing controls.
I will make you the presenter right now.
Awesome, thank you. And how's that? You guys seeing that now?
I think it's taken just a minute for the catch up. There we go. We can see it now. Thanks, Kawika.
Okay, terrific. So yeah, I'm with the Maui College Software Development Center, and we've had an ongoing relationship with the Department of Human Services, Social Services Division for a few years now, helping them to provide periphery tools to supplement what was mentioned earlier, an old 30-year-based, terminal-based system. So our primary role is to help provide things that system can't provide, to help with a lot of data collection reports that aren't available through that system. To that end, it's also more of a modern system, something we're kind of would be more used to. Instead of a terminal system, our solution is web-based. It's a web-based tool and make it easily accessible. So that's kind of the foundation for what this tool that you're seeing on the screen is and where it comes from. We call this tool Shaka. It at one point started off as an acronym, which isn't so much as relevant as it was when it initially started. But we all know Shaka in Hawaii is the hand gesture with the thumb and pinky extended as a greeting of acknowledgement and solidarity. And so if I mention Shaka, that's this tool that we have that's comprised of a lot of different things, and we're going to be speaking about the specific things from the project that was being covered today. It's a modern web-based information management system, again, to help supplement the CPSS system and the things that it's not capable of. The 60-day tracker, what we see right now on the screen is basically a list of investigations. It is redacted, data redacted for today's presentation. But this is a general investigative list. It may or may not be your primary screen depending on what your role is as an investigator or as a worker or as a supervisor. But it is one of the primary screens to start off on to see what your caseload is. I'm going to dive straight into the tracker, and we're going to bounce kind of back and forth. And if there are any technical questions that you'd like to ask that aren't covered or that we don't get to, please feel free to let us know. We're more than happy to answer them at the end of the presentation, or even offline if you wanted to carry that discussion offline.
This is Scott. I'm with Kawika here at the Maui College. And just to reiterate a little bit more about this screen, this is somewhat of the summary screen of all intakes that are active or case investigations within a specific section. We chose Maui sections, as you can see. If you can scroll down on this a bit, Kawika. So this is what we've developed as a tracking tool, and we'll get into the 60-day tracker right after this. But as you can see, there's bars off to the far right-hand side. So there are 9 elements within our 60-day trackers that tie into our law, procedure, and rules. These are mandated elements that workers should be doing, need to be doing, and have to complete. So this serves as like a one-shot look at a glance at your case activity. So you can see what Kawika's pulled up here. There's one that shows that it's not completed, and it's past what we call our 60-day period. There is an extension granted per se, should there be something that comes up that the investigation could not be completed. For example, if we're waiting for certain docs, et cetera, from the banks, or there's a lawyer request for some reason as far as some situation within the case, we have that flexibility, that is, to extend past the 60-day period with the supervisory approval. So just some other elements that we put into the tracker: a one-shot glance at casework services. When they come here, it's chronologically listed by date per se, so that they can look at what's most urgent that's needing to be done by looking at this. So we felt this was an important tool, not only for the workers, but also as a management tool for supervisors to make sure and see that their workers are keeping up to date with the procedural requirements based upon our rules and regulations.
So, and the hard part to convey is that this is in contrast to our older terminal-based system, which doesn't have as much visual cues to help hone our attention to certain things, which this does. Which, depending on the system that you may or may not use, if you're still stuck in the same boat that we are and you're on an old terminal system, then maybe you can see the benefits of moving towards more of a modern system. If you're not, then maybe this is something that you already have. But a lot, like Scott described, a lot of the things on this main page are just visual cues and indicators, and as much pertinent information as possible for the investigator, but also for the supervisor to help consume the status of the cases that are in front of them. And just taking it line by line, there's the identifying information, the intake number, case number, the case name, the island that this investigation is taking place on, where the allegations occurred. A worker who's been assigned, and if an intake has recently come in, it probably hasn't been assigned yet, but once they are assigned, they'll show up here. So workers can pull up their caseload just for them to separate it, which is different from how the Hawaii system currently works. If you're looking at all of this, a lot of the similar information in the old CPSS terminal-based system. There's a day count, which is where the 60-day tracker comes from. So by policy and as part of procedures, investigations have to be completed within 60 days. And right here is just a visual indication of how far we are into this investigation. So we can keep track of, what things need to be done to lead up to having this be, the investigation be completed. And on the far right is just a visual progress indicator, which is more for glanceable information. So you can kind of just see, and as Scott mentioned, as a supervisor, you can quickly try and narrow your attention down to which ones may be most at risk. which are the ones that are coming up around the 60-day turn. So the different visual cues on here are just something that the system of record, the terminal-based CPSS system, doesn't have or can't present, and those are some of the things that we're able to bring to the forefront here. I'm going to go ahead and dive into one of these specifically so we can see what exactly the 60-day tracker is. Now, from a technical standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. It just collects dates. So we have a list of, as Tammy mentioned, all these different items in the tool, the 60-day tracking tool, which have been identified as important investigative actions that need to take place to make sure that the investigation is progressing and that we are trying to hit all the important parts that we need to have done. So to that extent, we have some very basic and straightforward things on here, that a victim was interviewed, that the perpetrator was contacted and interviewed, and there's witness and collateral contact that may have been collected or not collected if it is relevant to this particular investigation. The disposition consultation with the supervisor, so that what this list also serves as for the investigator or the caseworker is a checklist to make sure they're hitting all the points that need to be done. One of those items being that that they are having discussions with their supervisor about their findings and what's going on. Eventually, once that occurs, that we also want to check to make sure that this disposition is shared and explained with the victim and or the legal representative, that same disposition was also shared with the perpetrator, and that the disposition was entered formally into the system of record, which is our CPSS terminal-based system, that the findings were also entered, and then ultimately that a notice of disposition mailing goes out. That's the formal letter that is sent to the perpetrator and the victims to letting them know the status of the case formally as found by Adult Protective Services. In the tool itself, we worked with program development and closely with a working group of investigators to try and help develop some kind of crib notes for these different things, just to give them reminders. In most cases, these things are pretty straightforward, but when you get kind of the corner cases or the boundary cases or things where situations are a little bit unusual for the case, it's always good to have a reminder of how that might fit into the dates that we want to collect for reporting purposes. So what we've developed are these nice little hoverovers for each one of these to kind of give cues and indications of what those particular data elements that we're trying to collect mean. But for the most part, the 60-day tracker is tracking dates. And we want to make sure that in a case where the progress is 100% complete, we hit each and every one of those junctures in the investigative life cycle of this particular case. Some additional things that we've had entered in later on because once workers are kind of used to adding things in here, it's really low-hanging fruit to put some other simple data collection mechanisms in here. And that's what you see down here towards the bottom, that an extension was granted, so we can kind of collect and keep track of those, where if for whatever reason or where the situation bears itself, if an extension beyond the 60 days is needed, that is given formally, and then it's recorded here so we can tie that into a data analysis of the different cases where those extensions were granted. Also, in the cases where the adult victim was found to be not vulnerable, just a quick and easy low-hanging fruit for us to be able to tell that and be able to associate that with this combination and then aggregation of all that data for reporting purposes. And then also, if case management surveys were provided, this is a goal that was set in conjunction with speaking with the legislature to be able to report on if case management activities were being provided, and to be able to help do that in a standard way across all the disparate islands that we have, to make sure that our procedures are a little standard. We decided to collect it here in one place. So that's one thing that having this tool allows us to do. It's not just collecting data, but it provides a standard way of doing that. So in our case, it's a little more important because we are disconnected by islands, connected by waters, but to make sure that we are following as can be done possibly a standard way of collecting information. Shaka provides that tool for us.
So we're going to move on to another feature of a tool that we developed, which is called the Service Tracker, based on community services that were offered for a particular case. we felt it important to track data as far as service referrals because, as Kawika mentioned, this could be a good evidence or support our efforts in trying to advocate for more services in various areas of the island, et cetera. So we kind of somewhat, if we can go to how we add a service, Kawika. Yeah. So we took the NAMRS service list back in 2015 when we initially applied for the NAMRS grant. And for those of you unfamiliar with APS jargon, NAMRS stands for the National Adult Maltreatment Reporting System. We were one of 13 states that initially received a grant from the ACL in order to try and uniform or streamline APS nationwide as far as what's being offered, services, etc. So we felt it important to somewhat incorporate what NAMRS or what the consensus was amongst the 13 states in order to provide services in these particular areas. So you can see we also included the hoverovers for what the NAMRS definition of these particular types of services are. But more importantly, for services, especially those of you who work in the rural areas, where services are not available, you can see that midway down on the tracker thing here, to click it off, because that's important information that can serve as support or evidence for advocation of services to be brought to specific rural areas, etc. We here in the islands, on the smaller islands in particular, there are no care homes at all, oftentimes having to transport victims to other larger islands for placement, etc. So when we went to this and thinking that, you know, down the line, federal oversight may be coming down the pipe. So we felt that incorporating what was agreed upon and what's kind of nationally recognized as a service list was very important to start off in incorporating this into our own web-based system. And there are many other elements. We're just showing you a couple here. If you notice off to the left-hand side, there's the intake tool. All the intakes are generated. There's an assessment tool done, which generates the 60-day tracker within the system. There's other elements of downloading documents into the particular case record into this system. But more importantly, we can also access the system on our cell phone, where we can actually hook up to Shaka online and actually dictate documentation and logs into the system itself. So, you know, moving into the future and knowing that, you know, we have a lot of young ones coming in who need to be or are more familiar with technology. Speaking for myself, that is, I'm not that attuned to it, but, you know, we need to get progression here with technology and adapt those types of systems that make it easier for our workers to do their job.
So as Scott said, we've just today, for the context of today's discussion, showed you the 60-day tracker and also this community services tracker that we have. There are a lot of other elements of this this Shaka tool that are hopefully incorporate a lot more into the overall picture. And if you have any questions about those that you'd like to ask that we can answer at the end of today's discussion, or if you'd like to contact us and take the discussion offline, we're more than happy to talk about our experiences and everything we've come across. Thank you, and that concludes our live demo portion.
Great. I think I'll put the screen back over to Daniel Lalutis.
Okay. Hi, this is Donna again. So just wanted to let you know that provided as a handout for you are the 3-page QA case review tool, which Tammy discussed, along with the 6-page, the 6 different abuse-specific QA tools. So the plan is to use these tools to develop practical investigation tools for the worker. So the abuse-specific QA tool is broken down into 2 parts as shown on the screen. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the sample of the QA tool for self-neglect. So the focus of the QA review was to determine whether there was documentation of the investigative action. So looking at the self-neglect tool, the first portion is regarding who was interviewed. So for example, if there was documentation that a treating physician was interviewed, the QA reviewer would indicate yes. So the questions below are examples of what information may have been documented from the interview. These questions are examples of what may be used in creation of a practical investigation tool for the worker. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving along to other possible interviewees. So for example, if in reviewing the case, it is clear that there was first responder involvement, yes indicates that there was documentation of the interview. For example, what was the first responder's impression of the alleged victim and the living environment? No indicates that no documentation of the first responder interview was found. NA indicates that it is clear that there was actually no first responder involvement. Next slide, please. Okay, so this portion focuses on the second half, which is what type of evidence was gathered. So for example, if the alleged victim's capacity is in question, is there documentation regarding the MD's capacity assessment of the victim? Or if the alleged victim was hospitalized, is there documentation regarding the hospital records? Scott, since you're a supervisor, would you like to elaborate a little bit more from your perspective?
So, when we did and developed the tool and the quality review, what we wanted to do is go back to the basic fundamentals. Did you see the victim? Did you document your log with the victim? Did you see the perpetrator? In this case of self-neglect, looking at the various situations that you might need to look at, not all being pertinent to each situation of investigation, but just as a tickler to help the worker along. So we thought of the two elements of timeliness, which was our 60-day tracker, and then qualitativeness, which is what this portion is of the tool. So going back to the basics, to help our workers get a foundation of what you have to cover. Given that, much like most of you, I'm sure, there's some turnover and you got new workers coming in. So to help people along with just the basic fundamentals of what you should be doing in casework services. So, this is the first time we've introduced this tool, and we hope to, improve on it as we go along, and, as well as the other tools of the various other types of abuse which we have as well. So we'll be developing these with our work groups, et cetera, to fine-tune them or add other elements that we may be lacking, in hopes that when we go out, we can make it a lot easier for the workers as far as, following what they need to be looking at when they're out in the field. Okay, next slide.
Hi, this is Lori again. So now that our grant has concluded, our next step is continued use and revision of our QA case tool and abuse-specific tools. Use QA tools to develop practical investigation tools for staff. Convene focus group discussions with staff. Identify and develop essential abuse-specific questions, and develop guidelines to analyze what's significant about the evidence gathered. Next slide, please. Challenges and barriers with our grant. Anticipated challenges and how were they handled. We identified entities who could actively participate in achieving our grant goals. We had open and honest discussions with participants to identify problems and solutions with parts of our grant. Next slide. Unexpected challenges and barriers and how they were handled. So some of the challenges and barriers were lack of departmental, fiscal, and contractual staff support. We learned quickly how to do fiscal budgeting and contractual development. We utilized our rapport with our Deputy Attorney General to review and approve our contracts quickly. We worked with our participants' contract attorneys for scope and budgetary concerns. Next slide. Mitigation strategies. Be assertive with fiscal and contractual needs early in the proposal development. We had to be really clear with what we needed and what the grant required. We also needed to hold departmental entities responsible for their grant commitments. Next slide. Successes. Advice for programs attempting to replicate this. Honest discussions with leadership on responsibilities versus funding, because you need to know who will be responsible to do the required work versus just the benefits of the grant funding. Secure leadership commitment to ensure completion of grant goals. Priorities can change from year to year, and you need to make sure you finish what you started. Next slide. Sustainability. How is the project sustained after the grant has expired? We did the creation of practical abuse-specific tools with workers or staff and unit input for consistent investigations. We've had informal talks with our departmental IT staff for the future of our NAMRS data retrieval and submission. Discussion with leadership of options and methods to maintain routine quality assurance reviews, such as large-scale statewide QAs or doing internal independent use of QA case review tools by supervisors. Next slide.
Okay, this is Scott again. This is our last slide of the presentation, funding. Of course, as many of you are probably in the same boat as we are, funding tends to be quite an issue with APS. So we would like to solicit support from Hawaii legislators that are concerned with the social issues of the elderly. As you all know, the silver tsunami is approaching us. 10,000 people daily turning 65 nationwide. Hawaii has one of the highest ratios of people 65 and over within the nation. Prioritization of funding of future goals with the limited funding that we receive from the state, and a pursuit of grants or other sources of funding. Like many of you, I'm sure we've got to think out of the box and create those partnerships and collaborations with those in the aging network. Excuse me. DHS has enacted what we call the 2-gen concept developed by the Aspen Institute. Our director has started this initiative back in 2016. What it entails basically is engaging with families and extended families as well as the community at large. We call it Ohana Nui here, which recognizes the 5 so-called pillars of success for families. Ohana Nui meaning the extended family. Hawaii has also one of the largest populations of multi-generational families in the nation, which is at approximately 12% of our families. So when we intervene with the family, oftentimes we're looking at just what our task is and not looking at the family as a whole. Ohana Nui recognizes the so-called 5 pillars of success, which is 1, housing, 2, nutrition, 3, education and financial stability, 4 is wellness and health, as well as most importantly for our seniors, social supports, having that human contact with others to stay healthy within the community. So looking at the whole family's needs rather than taking a tunnel vision approach and limiting our intervention to just our own expertise. In other words, engaging with other entities and moving away from the siloed mentality that some of us have had in the past to assist the family as a whole. This past year, APS in Hawaii here has reached out, for example, to the Legal Aid Society here in Hawaii, and through our collaboration, they were successful just this past summer in obtaining VOCA and DOJ grants for legal services to seniors on Oahu, which were non-existent prior to this from the Legal Aid Society. They did offer services on the neighbor islands, but for some reason, they didn't have funding to provide legal services to seniors on Oahu. These grants, the DOJ grant in particular, Title III, I believe, is also going to enhance those legal services for the neighbor islands or smaller islands here as well. Hawaii APS was also successful. We streamlined the Medicaid application process through our efforts of Ohana Nui with our MedQuest division. We're in the same department. It just seems that we've never really had that conversation of how we could expedite APS requests or referrals for long-term care eligibility. So Medicaid applications are now expedited and processed within 3 days upon submission of an APS client. So these are some of the successes that we've had in collaboration, and as Donna mentioned, how we can, get that funding or sometimes the funding isn't there, but it takes a village, and what we like to say is, not only does it take a village, but it's more so the relationships within those villages that makes things work. So that pretty much concludes our presentation today. We'd like to go to the next slide, please, which is a big mahalo to all of you, which means thank you in our Hawaiian language for participating today and listening to what we've had to offer you folks. And as Kawika mentioned, as we all mention, at any time, feel free to contact us. I think Andy has the information up on the handouts, etc. Kawika is willing to talk to others who may be in the same boat as we are as far as developing a platform to extract data or capture data across the realm of what we do as APS. So I'd like to thank you all again, taking your time out. And if you have any questions, Andy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Scott, very much. And everyone else, we appreciate all the information that you provided today. And just to piggyback on what Scott just said a minute ago, a lot of states have new computer systems where they have this sort of thing in place, but a lot of states do not. And a lot of states are in the same situation as Hawaii, where they're using antiquated systems that don't fit their needs, and they have to create something that does fit their needs that might be on the side. So one quick note as well, in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel, there should be a little section that says handouts, and you can download the slides from today where you can click on any of the links that were in the slides. There's also a copy of all the abuse-specific case tools that were mentioned during the webinar. I think that anybody who works at APS would probably be interested to look at those. So don't forget to download those. If you do forget, you can contact us afterwards. We'll make sure you get a copy of them. That being said, we do have a few questions for you guys. So I'll start with the first question. Are you doing case documentation on paper and then entering it into the 60-day tracker, or are you using two different computer applications? Again, are you still doing case documentation on paper and then entering into a computer system, or are you using two different computer applications for all your needs?
Okay, this is Scott. I'll take the question.
Sure.
As I mentioned, we actually have the capability of being out in the field and logging into the Shaka web-based system and going to the case log tab and actually dictating into the our cell phone, and it'll actually capture and incorporate it into a log within Shaka itself. Now, we're still toggling back and forth with our antiquated system, but we've got it down to the point where whatever log is entered into the Shaka realm, per se, will toggle over to our DOS system of CPSS. So there's various formats. Some workers like to handwrite notes and then type it out when they get back. Some like to put it in a Word doc, which notepad, and then copy and paste it directly into Shaka. So those are the different types of features that it's offered, depending on one's skill level, technologically wise, per se. We have that varying age group of workers, so there's a lot of options to document within the system.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Another question is, are the tools, and I assume they mean the case, the maltreatment specific tools, are they filed in a hard file somewhere, or are they scanned and put into a computer system? And again, are they maltreatment specific tools that you're filling out, are they scanned and stored electronically, or do you just keep hard copies of those?
This is Scott again. As we mentioned, we just developed these maltreatment tools, per se, and Shaka has the ability to actually scan the document and download it within the case within the Shaka system itself. We also keep hard copy case files on record as well, but all documents can also be downloaded within the Shaka realm.
So those maltreatment tools are paper tools, but like Scott said, to kind of supplement that as well, any paper documentation for a case, there is an electronic document area in Shaka where if you have an electronic version of a document, you can upload it to associate it with the case for the purpose of centralizing and making accessible to all those within a unit or section that are working on a case, to make it easily accessible to them there, instead of, like was mentioned, it being filed away somewhere and might be a little bit harder to find, especially if you're handing the case over to someone else.
Yeah, especially legal documents, POAs, trusts, etc. If you're out in the field, you can access Shaka on your phone, and you needed to reference that particular document, you can actually go on your cell phone and pull it up in the field as well.
Great.
Hope that answers the
question. For your service list, and I assume this is the service list you showed in the Shaka system, what are your outcomes? Is it a pre-created list? So again, for the service list that you use in Shaka, is it a pre-created list?
Yeah, we actually took the NAMRS identified elements of services and incorporated all the 17 elements that they felt were important and somewhat standardized nationally based upon the 13 other states that participated in the first year.
And we did add a language that was.
Yeah, and what we felt, as I mentioned, Hawaii does have quite a multicultural population diversity, that is, and in looking through the NAMRS stuff, we added one more field for 18, which was language access, which we couldn't seem to fit into one of the other 17 areas. So we felt that given, civil rights, et cetera, of English proficiency or, being able to translate things, et cetera, we also incorporated other, per se, with the language being in that category as well.
Great.
The NAMRS services are the baseline for the service data that we're recording, and then there's also a lot of extra attributes that go along with it that Scott mentioned during this discussion, which is to help us capture and collect information for the purpose of showing supporting documentation when going to the local government, whether it's county government or legislature, to show them and identify need of a service that isn't available in a particular area, be a rural area, or just if in particular service areas provider services aren't available. So in addition to the NAMRS baseline services, there are those additional attributes that we are collecting to help support any requests for funding or just to help identify areas where we're lacking in services.
Great. Thank you. Looks like we have 2 minutes left, and we do have one question, so we have time to get to this one. Who is responsible for taking all the data gathered in the tracker and digging down into the issues? How do you plan to make changes based on any large issues you discover? And again, I'll repeat that. Who's responsible for taking all the data gathered in the tracker and digging down into the issues? How do you plan to make changes based on any large issues you discover? So I think this question is about what will you do with this information for the future?
Yeah, so I can start that answer by saying that Shaka does provide an aggregate output, so we can, any data that's entered in the system, we can export, and then this is where I can kind of shuffle pass it over to Tammy, because that data has been ending up in the UH Center for Aging, where Tammy and her colleagues have been able to pour through that information to help provide insights.
And Tammy, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit, we'd love to hear from you.
Only that I want to confirm that it seems very easy to export information from the system for further analysis. It's very quick and it seems to be very straightforward, which is wonderful. So there should be access when someone's ready. I actually prefer if Donna and Lori could answer about the future, but I don't see any technical difficulties for sure in accessing the information, and the way it comes is very straightforward.
Take it? Oh, okay. So this is Lori. We're going to be looking at trends, issues, and topics that the sections and staff bring up, and look at areas that we need to either do more in or areas that we need to delete. And what's good about these tools is that we want it to be dynamic, so that it's continues to be relevant and useful to our staff.
Great. Well, Daniel, if you go to the last slide for us, I would like to thank all of our speakers today. We greatly appreciate all of your time, our 3 folks from Adult Protective Services and 2 folks from the university system in Hawaii. Everything you gave us was very, very helpful. So thank you so much for your time today in presenting this. If you would like to reach out to us here at the APS TARC, you've got an email address on your screen. You've also got a web address. So you can find our webpage, which was recently kind of rebooted. We have a lot of additional information on that page. The recording of today's webinar and the handouts from today will end up on that website as well. But we will notify everybody who registered for the webinar that the recording is posted so that you can take a look at it. But if you have any questions about anything Adult Protective Services related that we can help with, reach out to us anytime at this email address, and do check out our website. So again, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for today, and we hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thanks so much. Oh, and one last thing I forgot, please fill out your evaluation. Whenever we end this webinar, you'll get a pop-up screen that has like 4 or 5 questions. They're very brief. If you could fill that out for us, we'd be very, very grateful. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Andy. Aloha.
Adios. Bye.
Everyone.